Kids, they're so precious and innocent and harmless until they aren't. While we'd all like to think of kids as the purest of society, many kids throughout history have done terrible and even criminal things. Yes, criminal. There are kids who've done things so bad that they've been slapped with prison sentences. Very long prison sentences. Who are these evil kids who've received the longest sentences? Keep watching to find out. 10. Eric Smith. A lot of kids look forward to summer camp and all the activities that come with it. Swimming, arts and crafts, sports, and apparently murder. Yes, murder. This is all thanks to the Eric Smith case that rocked the 90s and became one of the most controversial true crime stories of all time. It all started on August 2, 1993, when Smith was just 13 years old. He was attending summer camp in Steuben County, New York, like other little boys. It was while he was riding his bike to camp that fateful day that he saw 4-year-old Derek Roby walking alone. Robbie was going to the same summer school as Smith, who then convinced him to come to a secluded wooded area. There, Smith went on to commit a series of horrific crimes. He strangled Robbie, bashed his head in with a rock, and even intimately assaulted him with a stick. For good measure, Smith took the Kool-Aid drink from Roby's lunchbox and then poured it over his wounds. Later that day, a search party went out in search of the little boy after his mother discovered that he never made it to the camp. His body was found hours later, and on August 8, 1993, 6 days after he took the boy's life, Smith confessed. He initially told his mother, who immediately contacted law enforcement. The nation was stunned. How could a boy who was barely a teenager do such a thing? Psychiatrists who examined Smith struggled to come up with an answer. He was diagnosed with intermittent explosive disorder, a mental condition that's been linked to violent behavior, but even mental illness couldn't save him from being charged with second-degree murder. Because he was a child, he was given a minimum of 9 years. Amazingly, Smith actually apologized to the Roby family, saying that he would trade places with his victim if he could, and that if it meant that he would go on living, I'd switch places, but I can't. Smith spent the first 3 years of his sentence in a juvenile prison before being sent to an open prison for young adults. From 2001 onwards, Smith spent time in multiple medium and maximum security prisons like the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, the Collins Correctional Facility, the Gowanda Correctional Facility, and the Woodbourne Correctional Facility in Sullivan County. Smith was famously denied parole 10 different times during his 27-year stay in prison, though he eventually got released in 2022. That's right, almost 30 years after his gruesome crime, Eric Smith was released from prison. He had told his parole board that he would move into a shelter or halfway house if he was released. As of the making of this video, Smith is believed to be living in Queens, New York, and while he continues to lay low and has even gotten engaged, his legacy as one of the longest-serving child prisoners remains. 9. T.J. Lane. Few things horrify us as a society like school shootings. A mass shooting is always terrible, but one that takes place at a place of learning with young people is always terrifying. Sadly, there is a long list of children who have become infamous for this exact reason. One of these is T.J. Lane, an American who was not even 18 when he killed 3 people and injured several others in the 2012 Chardon High School shooting. On the surface, Lane seemed like a regular kid. He was a sophomore at Lake Academy, which was near Chardon High School, and had your usual schoolyard drama over a girl. According to some of his classmates, he had beef with another boy called Russell King Jr., who was dating his ex. The 2 boys apparently planned to square up, and Lane even started lifting weights to prepare for the incoming brawl. High school boys fighting over a girl? Nothing out of the ordinary, except that Lane would take this rivalry and his own violent tendencies very, very far. On February 27, 2012, at around 7:30 a.m., Lane went on a rampage and began shooting at students in the Chardon High School cafeteria with a .22 caliber handgun. In total, he shot at 6 different students and struck 5 of them. Incredibly, one of the students he shot and who ended up dying was Russell King Jr. In fact, some eyewitnesses recall that Lane specifically targeted him when he began shooting. In the midst of all the chaos, 2 members of the Chardon High School staff came out as heroes. Joseph Ritchie, who was a teacher, and football coach Frank Hall, both chased Lane out of the school. Yes, you heard us. 2 unarmed teachers chased an armed gunman from a school. But even with these heroics, tragedy couldn't be prevented. 5 students were hospitalized, and 3 of them, 16-year-old Daniel Parmertor, 17-year-old Russell King Jr., and 16-year-old Demetrius Hewlin, had died. Lane didn't get very far after carrying out the gruesome attack and was arrested by police stationed outside of the school. He was initially tried as a minor until a judge decided that he was competent enough to be tried as an adult. He faced several charges, including 3 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of aggravated attempted murder, and 1 count of felonious assault. As you might expect, he pled guilty to these charges and was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole on March 19, 2013. While some might quietly sit in jail and contemplate their actions, Lane actually tried to escape. That's right, on September 11, 2014, Lane and 2 of his fellow inmates tried to escape from the Allen Correctional Institution in Lima, Ohio. Luckily, they were caught and returned to jail, and Lane hasn't made any more jailbreak attempts yet. 8. Brian Lee Draper and Tori Michael Adamczyk. If you ask most people what they're scared of, you'll probably see a home invasion somewhere on that list. It's an eerie idea, the thought that your safest space could be broken into and you could be harmed. Sadly, that is exactly what happened to Cassie Jo Stoddard at the hands of her classmates Brian Lee Draper and Tori Michael Adamczyk in 2006. The wildest thing about the case, Draper and Adamczyk were just 16 when they committed both a home invasion and a murder. But why? We'll need to take it back a bit. On the night of September 22, 2006, Stoddard was house-sitting for her aunt and uncle and got a few visitors. They were her boyfriend Matt and her classmates Brian and Tori. Nothing out of the ordinary at first. She gave them a tour of the house, they all watched a movie, and Draper and Adamczyk left soon after. What she didn't know was that the two had left the basement door unlocked and came back in a creepy getup complete with painted masks. Once back in the basement, the two tried many times to lure Stoddard and her boyfriend down to scare them. This included turning the lights on and off and making loud noises, but none of this worked. Now, to be clear, Stoddard and her boyfriend were creeped out, but not enough to completely leave. Her boyfriend's mom offered her the chance to come to their place for the evening, but she didn't want to. Leave the house and pets alone. At around 10:30 p.m., her boyfriend Matt left for home, and once the two heard him leave, they began their devious act. They cut the lights, went upstairs to where Stoddard was, and attacked her with several knives. According to the police, she was stabbed 30 times, with 12 of these being possibly fatal. 5 days later, on September 27th, the two 16-year-olds, yes, 16-year-olds, were arrested and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Investigations immediately began and uncovered even more horrifying facts. Even though they were teenagers, the killing was not a spur-of-the-moment affair. They had planned in advance to kill their classmate. According to their confession and the videotapes where they recorded their plans, they were inspired by Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the boys who carried out the Columbine High School shooting years before. Adamczyk also said he was inspired by the very gory Scream movie series. Yikes. The case went to trial, and both were found guilty of their charges, and their sentences were beyond hefty. Both got life imprisonment without the possibility of parole and 30 years to life for being convicted of conspiracy to commit murder. While both Draper and Adamczyk, now adults, have tried to appeal their sentences multiple times, they have been denied and continue to serve time in the Idaho State Correctional Institution. 7. Joshua Phillips. The case of Joshua Phillips is harrowing not just because he was only 14 years old when he became a murderer, but also because his victim was a very young child of just 8 years old. Phillips had a violent upbringing himself, as he was the son of a violent drug addict father who was a terror in his household. Still, those who knew Phillips said that he never showed signs of violent tendencies himself. That was until, in 1998, he became one of the most infamous child killers in modern history. His account was that on November 3rd, a neighbor girl called Maddie Clifton came over and asked him to play. Seems innocent, right? Well, this was already a tricky situation because his father didn't allow other children in the home when he wasn't around, and especially disliked little girls. But Phillips agreed and went outside to play baseball with her. According to his recounting of the story, he accidentally hit her with a baseball bat while playing, and she began screaming. He said he was afraid of what his father would do if he came home and found out what happened. His solution to the problem, however, was a deadly one. He hit her with the baseball bat again, and hid her under his bed, and even carried on a conversation with his dad later in the day. But once he saw that the little girl was still alive, he went even further. He slit her throat and stabbed her in the chest a horrifying 7 times until she died. Naturally, Clifton's parents were concerned when she didn't show up at home, and a search party was started to find her. In a bizarre twist of fate, Phillips actually joined the search party for the girl he had killed. Speaking to prosecutors later, he said that he disassociated and entered a fantasy world where he hadn't done anything. That was my defense mechanism for everything when I was a kid. I never made the decision to ignore it. I just did, he said. The search went on for 6 days until Clifton's corpse was discovered by Phillips' mother under his bed. She immediately called the police and her son was arrested and eventually confessed to the murder. Interestingly, when Phillips was taken to trial, he was tried as an adult in a case that had gripped America. The media circus was so intense that the trial had to be moved to a different county. But media aside, it was an open and shut case. Phillips was never called on to testify, and the matter was concluded in only 2 days. On July 8, 1999, Phillips was convicted convicted of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Since then, he's taken college courses in prison and even now works as a paralegal and has offered to apologize to Clifton's family in person. Nevertheless, all his appeal attempts have been denied. 6. Ashley Martinson. Most of us are familiar with the feeling of confrontation with parents. It's never fun and sometimes we lash out. But in the case of Ashley Martinson, a confrontation with her mother and stepfather, Tony Ayers, led to murder, an attempt to flee the state, and several decades in prison. From what investigators have dug up, life in the Martinson household was not pleasant. She was estranged from her biological father. Previous partners of her mother had abused her, and her stepfather was a violent man with previous kidnapping, sexual assault, and domestic abuse charges. The relationship between Ashley and Tony was already on shaky ground when he and her mother found out about her older boyfriend. This led to a fight on March 7, 2015, after which Ashley wrote on Facebook that her stepfather was abusing her mother and that, "I want to kill him so f***ing bad, take one of his guns and blow his f***ing brains out." At one point, Ashley ran into her room and locked the door, with Tony outside banging on the door. Then, she did the unthinkable. She shot at him several times with a shotgun, killing him. Ashley's mother heard the commotion upstairs and went to investigate, but she too was killed by her daughter with a knife. All the violence in the Martinson household had finally reached fever pitch, and now 2 people were dead. Realizing what had happened, Ashley did damage control. She locked her siblings in a closet with food supplies and fled the state of Wisconsin with Ryan Sisko, her 22-year-old boyfriend. The day after the killings, her stepsister called the police, who discovered the bodies and immediately went after Ashley and her boyfriend. Luckily, they didn't get too far and were apprehended in Boone County, Indiana, and Martinson was sent back to Wisconsin to face trial. When she was questioned by the police, she gave different versions of the story. Initially, she said that it was her mother who killed her stepfather, and then she killed her mom in self-defense. But this story fell apart after one of her siblings testified to seeing Tony's body and said that Ashley had likely killed him. She then said that she'd stolen Tony's gun and planned to kill herself, but then shot him after deciding that he deserved to die more. She was tried as an adult and faced 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide and false imprisonment. She initially pled not guilty by reason of insanity, but then pled guilty to second-degree murder. She was found guilty and given 23 years in prison and 17 years of supervision. She has filed to have her sentence reduced in the past, but this hasn't worked out. Overall, the Ashley Martinson case represents many things to many people. Some see it as evidence of a child in a troubled home that was failed by her mother, and some see Ashley as a stone-cold killer. 5. Anissa Weier and Morgan Geyser. Quick question, have you heard of Slender Man? If you were on the internet in the 2010s, you probably have at some point. Slender Man is many things: an internet urban legend, the subject of a poorly received horror movie, and the alleged catalyst for an attempted murder. And believe us, that last part is not a myth or a movie. Now, many of us have done silly things as part of an urban myth or creepypasta. At most, we've said Bloody Mary in a mirror 7 times or forwarded a creepy email. We have likely not tried to kill our friend in the woods, as these 2 girls did at just 12 years old. The story goes that Weier and Geyser became obsessed with the Slender Man lore and decided, for some reason, to sacrifice their friend to the mythical creature. Yikes. For reference, Slender Man looks sort of like this and has been a popular internet creepypasta for years. Many people have made drawings, posts, and even games about him over the years, but these 2 took their love to the extreme. On May 31st, 2014, Weier and Geyser were playing an allegedly innocent game of hide-and-seek with their friend Peyton Isabella Leutner in the woods of Wisconsin when they attacked her. After pinning her down, the 12-year-old girls stabbed her a total of 19 times, even piercing vital organs. They then left her lying in her own blood after lying that they would get held and essentially abandoning her to die. You know what's crazy about this story? She didn't die. Despite going through trauma and unimaginable pain, Isabella found the strength to drag herself to the side of a road where a cyclist called for help. As for her attackers, they were apprehended hours later after they'd walked 4.9 miles and still had the murder weapon with them. They told authorities that they were going to the Slender Man's mansion and that they'd tried to kill their friend to appease him. After she was arrested, there was some controversy about whether Geyser would be fit to stand trial, as she was diagnosed with early-onset childhood schizophrenia. She was initially sent to a mental facility, but after receiving treatment, she and her accomplice were charged with attempted first-degree homicide and attempted second-degree homicide, respectively, as adults. Weier pled guilty to the charges, and while Geyser initially accepted a plea deal, she too pled guilty. Both were found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, but still got prison sentences. Geyser got 40 years to life, while Weier for 25 years to life, along with supervision. You might be pleased or horrified to learn that both girls have since been released since 2021. They will both be under supervision for many years, including no access to social media, and Weier will be under 24-hour supervision. 4. Lionel Tate. The idea that a child would get sentenced to life in prison without parole is crazy. What is even crazier is the idea that they would get out of jail and still somehow end up back in jail. But this was the unfortunate story of Lionel Tate. Lionel Tate's journey to criminal infamy began in 1999 when he was just 12 years old. That's right, he wasn't even in his teenage years when he committed the gruesome murder of 6-year-old Tiffany Unick in Broward County, Florida. But what led him to kill a small child in the first place? We might never know, but what we do know is that on July 28, 1999, Kathleen Grossett Tate, Lionel's mother and a member of the U.S. Army, was babysitting the little girl. She's reported that she got home tired from work, gave Lionel and Tiffany food, and left them watching TV while she went upstairs for a nap. Throughout the evening, Grossett Tate says that the two were playing loudly and causing a ruckus, and at a point, she threatened to punish them if they didn't keep it down. What she didn't know was that downstairs, something terrible was happening. Later that evening, Lionel went upstairs and told his mother that Tiffany wasn't breathing. She rushed down to find an unconscious Tiffany who looked like she had vomited. Ms. Grossett Tate called 911, but after Tiffany was taken to the hospital, she was declared dead. That on its own was horrifying, but what made it worse were the descriptions of her injuries. According to medics, she had cuts, bruises, a skull fracture, broken ribs, internal bleeding, a swollen brain, and a lacerated liver. The wounds were so terrible that they have been compared to those of falling from a 3-story building. Naturally, both Grossett Tate and her son Lionel were interviewed, and the boy confessed to what he'd done. According to him, he was practicing wrestling moves that he'd seen on TV and jumped on Tiffany from the staircase. But prosecutors were not buying it. At his trial, one of them said, "The acts of Lionel Tate were not the playful acts of a child. The acts of Lionel Tate were cold, callous, and indescribably cruel." On August 11, 1999, he was formally tried as an adult for first-degree murder. He had been given the option to plead guilty to second-degree murder, but this was rejected by his lawyer. This ended up being not a great choice, as he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This ruling was also a historic one, as he became the youngest person in modern U.S. history to be sentenced to life imprisonment. It was also so controversial that advocacy groups and even the prosecution begged that his sentence be reduced, and they were successful. In January 2004, a state court overturned the initial ruling and sentenced Tate to a year in prison and 10 years of probation. But that isn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. On May 23, 2005, a little over a year after having his sentence overturned, Tate was arrested again. It wasn't for murder this time, it was for threatening a Domino's pizza delivery man outside of a friend's place. Tate was charged with armed burglary with battery, armed robbery, and violation of probation, and in 2006 was sentenced to 30 years in prison and another 10 years in February 2008. As of this video, he's serving out his sentence in the Charlotte Correctional Institution. 3. Kristen Pittman. All the details of the Pittman case only become more disturbing as the story unfolds. Pittman's story started in a similar way to a lot of the kids on this list. Her home life was unstable. Her mother had abandoned her more than once, and her dad was known to be abusive. By 12, she had been in trouble with the law, run away, fought with other children, and threatened to harm herself. But there was one source of stability in her life: her grandparents. After a stint in a facility for troubled kids, her dad sent Kristen, who went by Christopher at the time, to live with them in North Carolina. The problem was that the doctor he was seeing there didn't have any Paxil tablets to give him, which was what Christopher usually took. Instead, he was given Zoloft, another SSRI drug. Fun fact about the two drugs: they aren't supposed to be used as substitutes for each other at all. Some of the possible side effects include hallucinations, paranoia, depression, and aggression. Yikes. To make things worse, the doctor decided to double his dose of the medicine after he complained about these side effects. Pittman began having what has been described as manic episodes, and that is when things got truly worse only a few days later. On November 28, 2001, Pittman had the mother of all bad days. He fought on the school bus, caused a ruckus in church, and was punished by his grandfather for trying to leave his room after being told not to. In a rage, he went into his grandparents' bedroom and murdered them with their own shotgun. After the killings, he started a fire in the house with candles and drove out of town with their dogs, guns, and $33. But he didn't get very far and was caught a few counties from his grandparents' house. Initially, he tried to lie about a non-existent black man who killed his grandparents and kidnapped him, but this story didn't hold up. Keep in mind, he was 12 years old when all of this happened. 3 years later, on Monday, January 31st, 2005, he was tried as an adult in what ended up being a very messy messy case. Defense argued about the impact of Zoloft and how that might have affected his mental state. At least one juror also admitted that they broke court regulations about speaking to other people about the case. In the end, though, Christopher was convicted of murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison in February 2006. But like many cases involving kids and murder, it garnered media attention, including an episode of 48 Hours dedicated to it and a petition to free Christopher. Pittman has also come out as a transgender woman while in prison and now goes by the name Kristen. In December 2010, Kristen entered a new plea bargain that saw her admitting to voluntary manslaughter and serving 25 years. In February 2023, she was released from prison and will spend the next 2 years under state supervision. 2. Ricky and Danny Preddy. While a lot of the kids with the longest sentences tend to come from the United States, our friends from across the pond have their own share of juvenile criminals. 2 of the most famous are the siblings Ricky and Danny Preddy, who, at the ages of just 16, committed one of the best-known murder cases in the UK. The murder took place on the 27th of November 2000, with the victim being a Nigerian schoolboy by the name of Damilola Taylor, who was just 10 years old. According to CCTV footage taken on the night, Damilola left a library in Peckham for his home on the North Peckham estate and was attacked by the siblings, who were part of a gang. The gang in question were called the Young Peckham Boys and were known for terrorizing the streets of South London. The boys, who were 12 and 13 at the time, had been in trouble with the law but were now taking their illegal activities to new heights. Damilola was stabbed in the thigh with broken glass and bled out in a stairway. While an ambulance was called to get him to the hospital, he passed away just 10 days before his 11th birthday. Surprisingly, despite the CCTV footage, his killers were not apprehended for several years. 4 arrests were made, which included the Preddy brothers, but all were released by a judge. But they were eventually caught, thanks to the advent of new DNA testing that found traces of Damilola's blood on the sneakers and sweatshirts of his killers. The Preddy brothers and another boy named Hassan Jihad were arrested in connection with the killing. Jihad was cleared of charges and the brothers were released, though with the possibility of a retrial later on. The retrial did happen, and on the 9th of August 2006, the brothers were finally found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 8 years in prison, which Damilola's parents saw as very unfair. Eventually, both boys were released from prison in 2010 and 2011, but this was not the end of their run-ins with the law. Ricky was arrested again on the 13th of March 2011 for breaking his parole conditions by associating with gang members. After being released a year later, he was yet again seen associating with gang members. Then in 2020, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison after running his car into a police officer and causing serious injuries. As for his brother Danny, let's just say he didn't fare any better. He was released from prison in 2010 but was rearrested months later for breaking his parole conditions. While in prison, he got into trouble for beating up another inmate, but was still released in 2012. 16 days later, he was once again arrested for violating his parole conditions. Good Lord, the Damilola Taylor case is truly a heartbreaking case of a young life taken too soon, and 2 brothers who seem determined to fall out with the law at every turn. 1. Nathaniel Brazil. We've all had teachers that we don't like, and usually, we resort to giving them a funny nickname or complaining about them to friends during lunchtime. We certainly don't take to shooting them with a gun like our #1 entry. Yes, you heard that right, a gun. Before he became an infamous child criminal, Nathaniel Brazil was just a regular 13-year-old at Lake Worth Middle School in Lake Worth, Florida. It was the last day of the school year, but Brazil had gotten in a bit of trouble. He threw a water balloon and was sent home early by his teacher, Barry Grunow. No problem, right? Actually, there were about to be problems, and a lot of them. Once home, Nathaniel took a .25 caliber handgun, went back to school, and shot his teacher dead. The whole affair was as bizarre as you'd imagine. Granted, Nathaniel's home life was very troubled and the police had been called several times because of domestic violence incidents, but friends recall that Nathaniel was not an aggressive child and that Grunow was even his favorite teacher. No one could understand it. Nathaniel was put on trial as an adult, and while he didn't get convicted of first-degree murder, because that would have required proof that the act was premeditated, he was convicted of second-degree murder and aggravated assault. His sentence, a mind-blowing 28 years in jail and 7 years on probation. He has been serving out his sentence at Jackson Correctional Institution and has actually spoken to the media over the years. He said that he regrets his decision and wishes he had never picked up the gun in the first place. My very first mistake that led to this whole situation was taking the gun in the first place, he said in an interview with ABC from prison. Had I not have taken that gun, I wouldn't be here right now. In the years since the tragic killing, his teacher's widow, Pam Grunow, filed a lawsuit against against the owner of the gun, the shop that sold the gun, and the Palm Beach County School Board and got a $1 million settlement. Brazil is set to be released from prison in a few years, and while he's looking to pursue a new path after continuing his education in prison, his legacy as one of the most infamous child killers still lingers. If you think these stories were intriguing, wait until you see these ones on your screen right now.